If this kind of content is your thing, let the algorithm know, like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. The darkness had settled in like concrete poured over the world, thick and permanent. It was mid-November, and the sun was gone for 4 months, leaving the research outpost, Cobalt 7, to breathe shallowly under the weight of the Arctic night. Everything at the base was colored in shades of gray and the harsh, lonely yellow glow of the perimeter floodlights. Henderson Grant, 42 years old and carrying 30 extra pounds he'd acquired mostly from microwave popcorn and base ration stew, had drawn the short straw. His job was routine, brutal, and necessary. Check the automated weather station about 1 1/4 miles out before the forecasted blizzard hit. Henderson was a heavy man, slow and deliberate in his movements. The kind of guy who took his time because the wind could rip you to pieces if you hurried. He had pulled on 3 layers of thermal gear, his face already disappearing behind the massive fur-lined hood of his Arctic parka. The cold here was not merely a drop in temperature. It was an active, malevolent pressure crushing the metal structure of the base, making the walls groan like dying elephants. It was the weight of the ocean pressed into solid air. In the last flicker of light caught by the perimeter searchlight, they saw him hauling himself onto the track-equipped snow machine, an aging relic they called the Mule. He carried a specific tool for the job, a wrench, old and salt-eaten, its steel glinting for a second against the blackness, catching the light like a forgotten fragment of a faraway star. Then the snow machine roared, sounding terribly fragile against the profound silence of the ice, and he was gone, swallowed by the 47th parallel. They lost the picture on the external camera feed precisely 20 minutes later. The image simply dissolved into snow and static. Simultaneously, the wind, which had been merely sharp, turned vicious. It howled through the antenna masts, sounding like a trapped animal, a sound that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Then came the voice, a sound that ripped through the squelch of the radio. It was not loud, but it was ragged, choked, and strangely intimate. It was Henderson, but not the Henderson they knew. There was no pain in the tone, which was the first truly terrifying thing. This was a recognition of horror that exceeded the human scale. I found it, the city. The sentence was punctuated by a desperate, choking gasp, a sound of supreme realization. Then silence. Just the hiss of dead air, carrying with it a sharp metallic scent, like an old power transformer overloading, a distinct hint of burnt plastic clinging to the static. The echo of that last impossible phrase hung in the air of the radio room, shimmering above the instruments. They waited 6 hours before the storm let up enough to send out a proper search party. 2 younger technicians, bundled against the chill, their faces already stiff with apprehension. They drove out, following the precise global positioning system coordinates of the weather station, which was now offline. When the 2 men returned, they were pale beneath the flush of frostbite. They had not found a body, debris, or anything resembling a struggle. The snow surface was unbroken, pristine. The trail of the snow machine's tracks ended abruptly, as if the vehicle had simply dissolved into thin air. There was no sign it had plunged through weak ice. The ice was solid, miles thick. No splash, no wreckage, no oil slick. Just the sudden, absolute end of a path. The silence they brought back with them was heavier than the storm. A dead quiet that felt utterly unnatural even in the high Arctic. The base chief, a seasoned old geologist named Vinson, refused to entertain any talk of the supernatural. He scribbled out a preliminary report detailing failure to observe safety protocols under extreme weather conditions, a calculated bureaucratic lie designed to keep the base operating and the grants flowing. But when he looked at the dead radio, the shadow of profound doubt settled in his tired eyes. He ordered the search to cease immediately, instructing everyone to maintain radio silence except for routine reports. They were waiting, he declared, for an external specialist, someone who was trained to see the things that the normal eye refused to register. The next day, the wind slackened, giving the world a temporary, deceptive calm. One of the returning technicians, clearing wind-blown drifts near the base perimeter, stopped dead. Pressed into the dense, crusty snow, visible for only a few minutes before the breeze started to fill it, was a print. It was massive, perfectly symmetrical, resembling the paw of a very large wolf. The proportions were terribly wrong. The imprints for the digits were too defined, too perfectly articulated, suggesting the weight had been distributed vertically, centered, like a bipedal creature. It was not an animal track. It was an imprint of a foot engineered for bipedal weight distribution. The technician stared at it, the image burning itself into his memory. A cold, perfect lie written in the snow. He did not say anything to Vinson. He decided that some things were too real to be written down in a report. He just scooped up some fresh snow, packed it down tight, and tried to forget the geometrical horror of that frozen print. The dread in the base was starting to move. Dawson Reedley arrived 3 days later, ferried in on a small, twin-engine transport plane that screamed through a narrow window of decent weather before the sky clamped down again. He was 39, lean, and wore his pragmatism like a second skin. Dawson dealt in facts, in verifiable data, in the clean, unforgiving logic of mathematics and remote sensing. The Arctic was not a spiritual vacuum or a place of primal fear to him. It was a complex set of environmental variables. He was an operator of advanced robotic systems, specializing in deep relief cartography, and he trusted the silicon chip far more than he trusted human instinct. His arrival was accompanied by his specialist equipment. The excavator, a huge track-equipped ground drone, designed for navigating rough terrain and equipped with heavy-duty radar for subsurface imaging. The moment Dawson stepped out of the transport, the cold hit him, instantly stealing the breath from his lungs. It was frigid and corrosive. But the chill outside was nothing compared to the atmosphere inside Cobalt 7. The base was on a nervous razor's edge. The air inside the modules was stale, a suffocating mixture of recycled oxygen, diesel fumes from the generator, and a distinct metallic, faintly sweet odor. It was the smell of sickness and deep anxiety, a scent akin to old, congealed blood, lacking the typical rustiness of iron. He moved through the hallways, watching the crew. Their faces were drawn and pale, their movements jumpy, their eyes flicking toward the ceiling every time the wind hammered the external walls. They had the look of men who had not slept properly in days. Dawson felt a familiar, cold wave of professional contempt wash over him. His task was straightforward: locate the missing man, confirm the incident, and provide Vinson with a clean, defensible closure report. Dawson immediately sequestered himself in the communications room, demanding access to all recent data streams. He started with the satellite imagery captured in the hours leading up to Henderson's disappearance. He scrolled through the black and white low-resolution shots. Nothing but flat, endless ice. Then he started applying the filters. Using the thermal scanning overlay, the image changed. The vast white expanse was mostly an even, sub-zero blue. But at the coordinates Henderson had been approaching, Dawson found an anomaly. It was not a gradual change. It was a sharp, geometrically precise temperature drop, forming angles and straight lines where there should only be the chaotic randomness of nature. It resolved as an enormous underground icebox, unnaturally cool, rectangular, and vast. Dawson leaned closer, fighting the sudden irrational need to rub his eyes. He increased the resolution to maximum, pulling on every processing trick his system possessed. For a flickering moment, perhaps only 1 or 2 seconds, the image solidified. Where the thermal scan had shown only a void, the system now resolved structural integrity. Perfect straight lines appeared, clean angles, parallel walls, and intersecting corners. It was architecture. These were engineered structures hidden only inches beneath the surface. The image immediately pixelated, lost in the noise, but not before Dawson had seen enough. The rationalist within him, the man whose entire existence was predicated on logical sequence, felt a sharp, cold jab of disbelief. He struggled to reconcile the sight. Perfect, mathematically clean structures hidden under millennia of ice, with the geological records. The structure was impossible, yet the data was pure. Dawson ran the sequence again, 50 times. Each time, the faint ghost of the geometry flickered, challenging his sanity. The subtle, chilling thought began to seep into his tightly ordered worldview. The ice covering this place possessed a fluid memory, a brief, fleeting inability to conceal what lay beneath. He stood up. If this structure was real, it demanded exploration. But something about the perfect, uncompromising nature of the geometry screamed wrong. The structure was not merely ancient, it was alien. Dawson reached for the controls of his prized instrument. He kept this thermal data to himself. The others were too brittle. He sent the excavator to the exact coordinates of the anomaly. Using the drone's low-frequency radar, he would map the depth and structure. He needed proof that his systems had not played him a cruel, terrifying trick. The clock was ticking, and whatever was down there was waiting. The excavator, a rugged piece of engineering that resembled a miniature armored personnel carrier, rattled across the frozen expanse. Dawson controlled it remotely from the base, watching the twin camera feeds with clinical intensity. As the robot approached the coordinates, the radar readout began to vibrate wildly. The data streaming back to Dawson confirmed his terrifying suspicion. Directly beneath the ice sheet, there was a cavity, vast and deep. The air pressure within the structure was anomalously high. It was sealed but actively pressurized by an unknown internal energy source. Dawson guided the drone over the exact center of the thermal signature. He swept the surface cameras, hunting for a natural fissure. He spotted it, a hairline fracture, barely visible, dusted over with fresh snow. It was a weak point, formed by years of shifting ice, and it was his entry point. He activated the drone's drill. The reinforced tungsten bore screamed as it chewed through the ice. It took 12 hard minutes. Finally, with a sound like a wet cough, the drill broke through the ceiling of the void. Snow dust and pulverized ice billowed up, then settled, revealing a perfect circular hole perhaps 3 feet across. Dawson maneuvered the excavator to the edge of the opening and deployed the cable system. The heavy robot lowered itself slowly into the darkness. The visible light camera registered nothing but void. Dawson switched to the infrared spectrum, and then he saw it. The city. It was colossal, a massive labyrinth carved seemingly from the very substance of the ice shelf itself. This was not a ruin of human endeavor. It bore no resemblance to the rough-hewn stone of ancient human cultures. The walls were unnaturally smooth, polished by immense internal forces until they shone with a deep, unsettling blue hue. The architecture was aggressive, composed of razor-sharp angles and impossibly high, tapering spires that rose like the teeth of a trapped monster. Everything was mathematically precise, geometrically perfect, speaking to a building code that had nothing to do with gravity or human scale. The air inside the cavity, picked up by the drone's sensors, was lethally clean and unnervingly still, a dead environment, yet preserved with pristine clarity. Dawson slowly guided the robot along what appeared to be a narrow, slick thoroughfare. The walls of ice had faint striations etched into them by some internal churning wind, patterns that reminded him sickeningly of coarse, wet animal fur. And then down the endless, silent avenue, he saw him. Henderson Grant. He was stationary, standing perhaps 65 yards away. But he was not standing upright. He was on all fours, clad in the remnants of his thermal gear, the hood pulled up, shrouding his head. The sight was instantly nauseating. Henderson's posture was fixed, utterly rigid, but his massive shoulders were moving, contracting and expanding in a rhythmic, convulsive shudder. A terrible, physical metamorphosis. The most disturbing detail was his head. It was pitched low, sniffing the slick blue ice pavement beneath him, tracking the ground like a predator. Dawson, his voice suddenly dry and frail, activated the drone's external speaker. He needed confirmation, the sound of sanity. Grant. Henderson, can you hear me? The figure stopped shuddering. Slowly, with terrible reluctance, the head lifted. Dawson's heart executed a terrible, cold flip in his chest. The face was sheathed in a heavy layer of rime and condensation, but the features were still recognizably Henderson's, a cruel, broken facsimile. The eyes were what stopped Dawson's breath. They were enormous, utterly black, the pupils reduced to thin, shining vertical slits, the signature of a nocturnal hunter. They caught the faint infrared light and burned with a sickly internal glow. Then Henderson's mouth stretched. It was a physical impossibility. The smile was too wide, extending past the normal limits of the human cheekbone, wrenching the face into a mask of triumph and agony. The lips peeled back, revealing impossibly long, sharp, and uniformly pointed teeth, monstrously exaggerated incisors. It was a smile that did not belong on a human face. It was the absolute visualization of a trap. In the span of a single beat, the Henderson thing exploded into motion. It moved with a silent, sliding grace toward the shadows of a perpendicular street. It disappeared instantly into the deep blue light of the ice. "No, wait!" Dawson shouted, a desperate, useless sound. A split second later, the robot's visual feed dissolved into noise, followed by a violent physical surge of static through the speakers, and then the sickening thud of metal breaking on ice. Connection to the excavator was lost. The ice city had swallowed the machine, leaving Dawson alone in the stifling communications room, sweating profusely in the pervasive Arctic cold, clutching the dead controls. He had confirmation, and the truth was infinitely worse than he had ever imagined. Dawson stumbled out of the communications room. His report was met with a dangerous mix of disbelief and paralyzing horror. Vincent stared at Dawson as if he had grown a second head, muttering about pressure-induced hallucinations. But the memory of Henderson's impossible structural smile was too stark for Dawson to be dismissed. He knew what he had seen. He argued, not about monsters, but about cold weather trauma and the need for retrieval. "He's alive, Vincent, but he's gone hypothermic. He's damaged goods, but we cannot leave him down there. It's an ethical, operational imperative." He leaned hard on the pragmatism, using the language of procedure to mask the profound dread he felt. It took another hour of tense conversation, but Dawson got his team. Nobody volunteered, but 2 men were ordered. Jacob Hill, a silent, reliable communications technician, and Frank Doyle, a grizzled old-timer whose entire life had been spent navigating high-latitude terrain. Frank was a relic who knew the Arctic by the texture of the snow and the sound of the ice. But even Frank had a thin tremor running through his hands. They prepared quickly, moving with a desperate, suppressed energy. They loaded Polar Bear, the base's heavy-duty tracked vehicle, with emergency rations, satellite communication relays, and climbing gear. Frank, his face grim and set, went straight for the armory. He pulled out the base's pump-action shotgun, checking the action and loading it slowly with heavy slugs. His fingers twitched slightly, a subtle betrayer of the fear that was now a palpable entity, thick and suffocating. This was not a search. It was a desperate plunge into an unknown, inhuman space. "Keep your safety on till you see the whites of their eyes," Frank muttered, not looking at anyone. "And then, make sure you hit what you're aiming at." As they drove out, the Polar Bear groaning under its weight and the deep cold, Frank, who was driving, slowed unexpectedly. The ice sheet they were traversing looked normal, but Frank's intuition was screaming. "Something's off, Dawson," he said, his voice low and tight. "The ice isn't cracking. It's too soft, too springy." Dawson listened. Instead of the sharp, crystalline sounds of freezing water under pressure, the ice sheet felt unnervingly soft, emitting a deep, rubbery thud under the tracks, like driving across a gigantic, frozen drumskin. The entire high-latitude plateau was moving, subtly rising and falling in time with a vast, internal subterranean rhythm that defied all geological explanation. The sea of ice was breathing. They found the hole the excavator had made. The edges were already beginning to frost over, the wound in the ice trying to seal itself. There was no wind rushing out of the hole. Instead, Dawson felt a definite suction, a slow, inexorable draft pulling the frigid surface air down into the void. The city was inhaling. They rappelled down the slick, newly formed ice slope, their headlamps cutting weak cones into the blue darkness. Jacob went first, then Dawson, then Frank, who lingered at the edge, his massive boots scraping for purchase. As Frank's weight cleared the rim, Dawson heard a sickening, heavy shh sound above them. The light from above vanished instantly. The ceiling of ice, several feet thick, had slammed shut, sealing the wound with terrifying speed and precision. The perfect white surface above them had closed up, leaving them suspended in absolute subterranean blackness. Their escape route and all evidence of their entry had been erased. All 3 men froze, their breath clouding heavily in the sudden profound quiet. The silence here was different from the Arctic silence. It was dense, weighted, muffling sound until their footsteps felt loud and intrusive. Dawson inhaled, trying to regulate his breathing, and he registered the city's unique odor. It was overpowering, a pungent, metallic smell that reminded him simultaneously of stale ammonia and the fetid scent of wet dog hair overlaying a hint of sulfur. It was the smell of a filthy, massive kennel operating under clinical sterility. The walls, which he now examined closely, were not merely frozen water. They were extruding a weak internal light, a deep, pervasive cerulean blue that seemed to glow from thin, branching veins, like the vascular system of a cold, giant entity. They were standing inside a structure that had been grown, not merely built. Dawson gripped his climbing rope, the fear solidifying into cold resolve. They were no longer rescuing a colleague. They were trapped inside the heart of an organism. The deeper they moved into the ice labyrinth, the harder it became to hold onto the notion that this place was merely ancient or abandoned. The blue light intensified, creating an eerie, submerged atmosphere, washing out their headlamp beams. They moved through wide, angular streets that spiraled downward, drawn by the faint, invisible pull of the atmosphere. The snow that had coated the floor during the robot's descent was gone, absorbed, revealing the tracks. These were the large, terrifying paw prints from the perimeter, now seen in perfect clarity, pressed deep into the blue ice. Frank, an expert tracker, ran his gloved hand over one. "Look at this, Dawson. It is wrong," he whispered, his voice catching the humid air. "A wolf or a bear, they shuffle. Their prints are chaotic, off-center. These are like some protractor laid them down. Perfectly symmetrical, step after step, right on the midline." This was the terrifying proof. These were the tracks of a hybrid, a thing that had retained human balance and stride while adopting the massive paw of a predator. In a recessed doorway carved into the glassy wall, they found the first undeniable proof of Henderson Grant's fate. A piece of shredded thermal underwear lay balled up, ripped violently from the inside out. It was not stained with blood. Instead, it was soaked through with a thick, viscous, dark liquid. It was denser, almost like motor oil or cold asphalt, a thick black sap that steamed faintly on the ice. Beside the rag lay the familiar salt-pitted wrench, Henderson's mundane tool. It looked utterly pathetic, an artifact of normalcy in a dead world. Jacob Hill, moving cautiously ahead, was running the wideband radio receiver. He stopped abruptly, pressing his specialized Arctic headset tighter to his ears. Dawson looked at him, waiting. Jacob's face was pale, static mostly. But there's a rhythm. Jacob lowered the volume so Dawson could hear. It was not a roar or a cry. It was a rhythmic, incredibly low-frequency vibration, like a vast, subterranean purr. Beneath that bass thrumming, there was a sound like thousands of tiny, dry tongues rapidly scraping against frozen surfaces, a collective, continuous whisper emanating from the very ice beneath their feet. Dawson felt the sound travel not through his ears, but straight into his bones, vibrating his teeth slightly. It was the sound of the city breathing. A pervasive, low-frequency language that traveled straight into his bones. Dawson, trying to revert to his professional mindset, started mapping the area with his handheld laser rangefinder. His analysis yielded horrifying consistency. The architecture was rigid, uncompromisingly formal. Every angle was either a precise 90 degrees or a knife-sharp acute angle. The structure was not designed for utility, shelter, or aesthetic beauty. It was ritualistic, built according to internal alien mathematical laws, forming a vast geometric engine. "This isn't a tomb," Dawson breathed, realizing the chilling implication. "It's a machine. It's built to do something." As they descended deeper, the most immediate physical anomaly became undeniable. The temperature was rising. Frank, stripping off his heavy parka, wiped his brow. "Damn, Dawson. It's got to be 80 degrees Fahrenheit in here. We're in the Arctic. How is ice this hot?" The air was getting heavy, saturated with humidity. They shed layers until they were sweating in their base thermals. Dawson looked at the translucent blue walls. The ice was not just holding its shape. It was actively generating heat, a tremendous amount of thermal energy, localized deep inside the structure. Ice should be cold. This heat was organic, generated by an internal biological process. Whatever lay within the geometric city was alive. It was breathing, building, and generating enough heat to keep an oppressive environment under 1,000 feet of permafrost. The city was a vast, cold-weather organism, and they were trapped in its core. The oppressive warmth of the inner city felt paralyzing. It was a thick, viscous heat that sapped strength and sharpened dread. They were following a wide, spiraling avenue when they rounded an acute, razor-sharp corner. The light snagged on a figure 50 feet away. It was Henderson. He stood upright, but the stance was agonizingly wrong, his back bowed in an unnatural curve as if his spine had been rearranged to accommodate a different center of gravity. What clothing remained of his parka and thermal suit was shredded, hanging off him in limp rags. What lay beneath the tatters was no longer skin. It was a dense gray-brown covering, thick and wet-looking, an engineered hide filled with needle-like spines. The smell of wet dog and sulfur intensified immediately. Dawson felt a cold, sharp blade of terror slice through the heavy heat. The transformation was nearly complete. He saw details that defied every natural law. Henderson's arms were grotesquely elongated, dragging low. The hands had mutated into massive clawed paws, the digits ending in thick, curved black talons that scraped grooves into the blue ice. The musculature of his neck and shoulders had exploded, pushing out from the torso in thick, knotted cords, tearing through the last fibers of his ruined collar. The head was still human in basic outline, but the massive vertical slit eyes burned with a dull, phosphorus sheen in the gloom. The creature released a sound, and it was the most harrowing detail of all. It was a dry, rattling, broken cough, a sound of supreme physical suffering, yet infused with savage satisfaction. It was the sound of a human throat attempting human words, overwhelmed by the new, tearing vocal cords of a predator. This was their colleague Henderson Grant, trapped and weaponized inside an unrecognizable shape. Frank Doyle reacted instantly. He raised the pump-action shotgun, the cold steel gleaming briefly. The thing that used to be Henderson did not immediately charge. It moved sideways, a terrifying flowing motion, circling them with the unnatural grace of something that could ignore the concept of inertia. It was silent on its thick paws, a phantom stalking its prey. It was calculating, corralling them, using the geometry of the labyrinth to strip away their escape paths. It was forcing them deeper, toward the source of the heat, toward the thickest, warmest core of the ice. "Stay back, you son of a bitch!" Frank bellowed, and he leveled the gun. The blast was deafening, a sudden, brutal intrusion into the pervasive silence of the city. The noise echoed down the crystalline streets. The heavy slug hit the ice wall inches from the creature's shoulder. A massive chunk of blue ice exploded, showering them in glittering debris. But the Henderson thing did not flinch. It simply tilted its massive, rime-covered head, regarding them with intellectual interest. A quick study of cause and effect, recognizing the threat, but not fearing it. Then, with an impossible leap, utilizing its massive forelimbs and claws, it sprang onto the vertical wall of the street, digging its talons in, and bounded up into an overhead passage, disappearing instantly into the darkness. It moved with weightless speed, mocking the concepts of gravity and friction. Dawson lowered his own small, useless sidearm. The gun was trembling in his hand. "Frank," Dawson whispered, the words catching in his throat. It didn't slow down. "Son of a gun," Frank breathed, sliding the new shells in. "That was the darndest thing I ever saw." The realization settled over Dawson with the weight of the Arctic itself. The rules of human engagement were meaningless here. They were fighting an incarnation, a form engineered for this environment. The creature had successfully funneled them deeper into the core. Their flight was its strategy. They ran, driven by the sickening rattle of Henderson's cough roar, echoing from the passages above them. The pursuit was silent, save for that occasional, unnerving sound. They followed a spiral passage that seemed to bore directly into the earth. The ice here was changing color again, no longer the deep cerulean blue, but thin, almost perfectly transparent like glass. As they ran, Dawson glanced quickly through the walls. He saw movement, blurs of shadow, quick and indistinct, passing through adjacent tunnels. They were surrounded. The city was not empty. It was a teeming, hidden hive. The corridor finally opened up into a vast, cavernous space that looked like the interior of a massive, refrigerated opera house. The air here was stifling, humid, and permeated by the overwhelming, metallic sweet odor. In the center of the hall stood a structure. An enormous, perfectly smooth, cylindrical pillar of ice, glistening and transparent. This pillar was the undeniable source of the intense heat. Arrayed around the base of the pillar were dozens of figures. Some were slumped over, shivering violently, recognizable as human only by the remaining scraps of clothing. Others were further along the horrific spectrum of change, their bodies already swollen and covered in the nascent wet fur of the new form. Dawson realized they were looking at the transformation hall, the central processing unit of the city. It was an incubator. He looked closer at the central pillar. Within the crystalline ice, something was moving. Not water, but a thick, viscous fluid that shimmered with a dull, sickly yellow light, circulating slowly, like liquid mercury. This fluid was the engine. It pulsed, and with every pulse, Dawson felt a slight dizzying thrum through the floor. He was hit by an overwhelming, undeniable certainty. They were not hiding here. They were waiting. They were evolving. Then Henderson stepped into the center of the hall, closer to the pillar than the others, his transformation nearly complete. He straightened his immense body and looked directly at Dawson, ignoring Frank, who was raising the shotgun. Henderson spoke, the words agonizingly wrenched from his new throat, each syllable of victory over the beast within. They wait for the thaw. Arctic is dying. We must be ready," he gasped, a wet, rattling breath. We're only the start." He was giving them a rationale, a horrific explanation for the impossible geometry. This was a preparation for the future. The warming world was killing the ice, and they were adapting, changing, readying themselves for the transition from subterranean fortress to surface migration. Henderson tried to take another step, but the pain was too great. His attempt at human communication ended in a terrifying primal release, a shrill, ululating cry of pure triumph and bestial agony. It was a command. The entire hall moved. The dozens of creatures previously static or twitching in their agony rose with unnerving coordination. They were disciplined, moving with a cold, terrifying logic grafted onto predatory instinct. They were a new, intelligent species, organized and dedicated to their continued existence in the dark. Dawson realized the horrifying scope of the threat. They were witnessing the birth of an organized, cold-weather enemy. The air grew hotter, thicker. The central pillar pulsed faster, and the creatures began their slow, deliberate approach, cutting off the remaining avenues of retreat. The geometric horror was now kinetic. The amphitheater dissolved into chaos, a whirlwind of motion and sound under the sickly yellow glow of the central pillar. The creatures moved with precision, using the high, curved walls of the hall to cut off retreat, their talons scrabbling against the slick ice. The heat was suffocating. Dawson felt the humidity coating his lungs, making every breath a shallow struggle. Jacob Hill, the communications technician, had immediately scrambled to deploy the emergency satellite beacon, hoping to punch a signal through the massive ice cap. He was kneeling, furiously twisting the antenna, his face rigid with focus. Dawson saw the shadow move. It was too fast, a blur of gray-brown fur and muscle separating itself from the coordinated horde. It moved along the vertical wall, utilizing the architecture designed for its form. "Jacob, behind you!" Dawson screamed, but the words were lost in Frank's desperate, loud blast of the shotgun. Jacob looked up, his face a sudden mask of comprehension and pure, unadulterated fear. The creature struck with surgical violence. There was no scream, just a wet, tearing sound, like heavy canvas ripping under pressure, followed by a sickening heavy thud. Jacob Hill was eliminated, dragged backward instantly into a narrow, dark side tunnel. His satellite beacon, which had just begun to flash a tiny green light of acquisition, went dark. Its brief promise of rescue extinguished forever. Jacob did not survive the night. Frank Doyle let out a guttural roar, a sound of absolute terror and righteous anger. He swung the shotgun around and emptied the remaining shells into the oncoming mass of shadows. The scatter shot ripped into the creatures. One of the figures staggered and fell, twitching violently. It did not bleed red blood. The wound oozed the same thick, black, tar-like fluid that smoked faintly on the hot ice, releasing a sharp, acrid odor. The creature met its fate, but its fall bought them only a moment of horrified respite. "Go! Go!" Frank yelled. He seized Dawson by the collar and shoved him toward a narrow, vertical fissure in the far wall, a ventilation shaft barely wide enough for a man. Dawson scrambled into the cramped opening. The collective roar of the horde intensified, now a single, deep, resonating hum that vibrated the very structure of the city. They began to climb, pushing upward through the narrow shaft. It was a hellish, claustrophobic ascent. Dawson's headlamp beam was useless in the confined space, filled only with steam and hot condensation. As he clawed his way up, Dawson's gloved hand slipped. He grasped again, skinning his knuckles, and felt the surface beneath the slick coating of frozen condensation. It was the ice, but it was warm, damp and yielding. He pressed his palm against the wall, and through the thin fabric of his gloves he felt a faint, insistent throb. He felt the pulse of the city itself. The blue branching veins were not mere coloration. They were active. He was inside the respiratory passage of a giant, frozen organism. "Push, Frank, push," Dawson urged, hearing Frank's heavy, labored breathing right beneath him. The roaring from below had faded, replaced by an unnerving silence. Dawson felt a sudden, sharp drop in resistance. He was through. He used the last of his strength to shove aside the final, thin layer of ice overhead, a fragile ceiling that gave way with a crisp, welcome sound. He tumbled out onto the vast, open expanse of the ice shelf. The transition was immediate and violent. The raw, three-digit below-zero Arctic cold slammed into his body, instantly freezing the sweat on his thermals. But the pain of the cold was an exquisite relief. It was clean, honest, and normal. He looked around. Jacob was gone. The polar bear, their heavy, yellow-painted transport, stood perhaps 328 yards away, a small, defiant beacon in the crushing darkness. Frank emerged, wheezing, pulling himself onto the surface. "Get to the truck!" Dawson yelled, already stumbling toward the vehicle, his legs stiff and uncooperative. They ran, struggling through the deep, unpacked snow near the breakthrough point. The air, though crisp, still carried the lingering, sweet metallic scent rising from the breach. Dawson paused only long enough to confirm their escape. He looked back at the point where they had emerged. Already the surrounding ice was fusing. The thin vertical slit they had used to climb out was tightening, closing over with impossible speed. The wound was sealing itself, but black, acute shadows were rising through the snow, running across the hardened crust of the surface. These were not men struggling in heavy gear. These creatures moved with blinding, fluid speed, perfectly adapted to the surface. Their forms were fully solidified, no longer clumsy, transitioning monstrosities. They were hunters. "Hurry!" Dawson shrieked, hauling himself forward. They were perhaps 32 feet from the polar bear when Frank Doyle stumbled, falling into a drift with a groan. Dawson hauled him upright, and the light of his headlamp fell upon Frank's neck. Across Frank's jugular ran a long, deep, crescent-shaped claw mark. It was weeping that same thick, black, steaming liquid, the tar-like substance they had seen staining Henderson's remnants. The contamination was immediate, visible, and terrifyingly efficient. Frank gasped, clawing at his throat. His eyes, fixed on Dawson, were already clouding, and a terrible, slow red was beginning to bloom in the whites. "Go, Dawson." The words came out choked, immediately followed by a low, rattling growl, raw and foreign. Frank's hand shot out. It was a heavy, massive paw equipped with newly extended talons. He seized Dawson's parka shoulder, the grip instantly powerful and agonizing. The final, terrible physical betrayal had begun. The choice was instant, brutal, and utterly clear. Frank's grasp was tightening, driven by a new, inhuman strength. With a violent shove born of existential fear, Dawson wrenched himself free, ripping the heavy fabric of his coat. Frank stumbled backward into the snow. The transformation was accelerating exponentially. The human terror in Frank's eyes warred briefly with the predatory awareness, a fleeting moment of self-hatred and agonizing recognition. Dawson scrambled into the cabin of the polar bear. The dashboard lights came on. Dawson stabbed the ignition key. The diesel engine, chilled to the core, coughed once, twice. Behind him, 50 yards out, the black silhouettes had stopped running. They were congregating, a massive, milling pack, all turning toward the heat and light of the heavy vehicle. The engine finally caught, roaring to life with a triumphant, rattling clamor. Frank Doyle lifted his head from the snow. The red infection had taken over his eyes completely. He turned his fully transformed body toward the onrushing tide of creatures. He raised the pump-action shotgun, the sound of the pump action racking a fresh shell distinct even over the churning diesel. Frank Doyle's sacrifice was swift and loud. He fired into the pack. The heavy slugs tore into the nearest figures, knocking them backward. He emptied the magazine, the booming echoes swallowed by the deep night. The creatures paused, momentarily thrown by the resistance. That brief, desperate action gave Dawson the critical seconds he needed. He slammed the transmission into gear, flooring the accelerator. The heavy tracked vehicle surged forward with reckless speed. Dawson did not look back. He focused entirely on the faint yellow smudge on the horizon that was Cobalt 7, about 3 7/10 miles away. He drove blindly into the beginnings of a serious ground blizzard. A curtain of white thrown up by the angry sky to cover his retreat. But even over the hammering of the massive diesel engine, Dawson could hear the sound of the pursuit. It was a heavy, rapid, synchronized pounding. Hundreds of massive paws hitting the frozen ground in unison. A rhythmic, deep bass thrum that gained on him despite the polar bear's speed. Dawson gripped the wheel until his knuckles were white. He was driving across a thin, fragile crust. Below him was not the deep, frozen ocean, but a terrifying, vast emptiness filled with a surging, vital threat. The pursuit was relentless, gaining, fueled by a collective hunger and the absolute knowledge of their prey's destination. The lights of Cobalt 7 were close now, a fuzzy, glorious yellow glow slicing through the gathering snow squall. Dawson pushed the polar bear to its limit. He heard the base alarm system beginning to chirp faintly, sensing his frantic approach. He was almost there. He knew he had to get inside the perimeter and seal the base before the torrent of the night consumed them all. In the last agonizing moment before the tracked vehicle crossed the invisible safety line, Dawson risked one final glance behind him. The wind had briefly torn a hole in the gathering blizzard, granting him a glimpse of the terrain 300 yards back. What he saw erased the memory of Frank Doyle's human face and Jacob's silent end. The spot where they had broken through the ice was gone. Absolutely nothing remained. The surface of the high-latitude ice was impossibly smooth, pristine, and unbroken, a perfect, continuous sheet of white. The geometry, the terrifying, structured wound had vanished. The city had retreated, sealed itself with intelligent precision, erasing all evidence of its existence with frightening totality. But the creatures had not retreated with it. The horde was still coming. They were fully on the surface now, released from the architecture, moving with a feral, liberated grace. They were no longer the confused, angular beings of the underground. They had achieved their final form, sleek, powerful, and terrifyingly fast. Hundreds of shadows pouring over the ice toward the base. They were the evolved threat, ready for migration. Dawson slammed the polar bear to a halt inside the perimeter fence, leaping out of the cab before the engine had even died. He sprinted into the communications center, his body moving on pure, raw instinct. He grabbed the main broadcast microphone. His hands were shaking, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was flat, dry, and devoid of recognizable emotion, as if he were reading a highly classified geological protocol. He did not report an accident or a loss of personnel. He recorded the truth, intended not for the base chief or for one specific government body, but for anyone who might be listening across the empty wavelengths. Cobalt 7 reporting. The structure under the ice, the city, is not a place where they lived. It is a gate. They were waiting for the thaw. They adapted. And now they are here. They are moving. Dawson dropped the microphone, the sound of plastic hitting the console a tiny, pointless sound against the imminent onslaught. He moved to the observation port. The base floodlights illuminated the final horrifying approach. Hundreds of massive silhouettes surged toward the low walls of the outpost. Their eyes, fully open to the night, were phosphorescent. Thousands of sickly, flickering sparks in the consuming darkness. The collective sound of their arrival was a deep, resonant, celebratory howl, a sound that vibrated the very foundations of the base, announcing the end of the known world. The blizzard, answering the call, intensified further, thickening into a solid, impenetrable wall of white, engulfing the outpost and the unstoppable, ascending horde. The gate had opened and the creatures had emerged.